this training is about how we give feedback to our students and some best practices related to kind of evaluating students with their assessment. And I'm Lindsay Reinhardt. I'm the Field Education Director at WVU, and I'm presenting today with my colleague, Jamie, who can introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Jamie Messer, and I am the online field coordinator and clinical instructor for social work, generalist practice, and advanced practice on the online side.
So we appreciate you taking the time with us today. And I will say now, and I tried to say this in the announcement, we are going to go over a lot of information, but we will have an interactive part of this kind of midway through where we'll get into some breakout rooms and practice some of what we're doing. So just stay tuned for that component. All right, so what we're going to cover today, we're going to spend a bit of time just kind of reviewing the social work competencies and practice behaviors, because that really lays the foundation for everything related to the assessment. We're going to talk about some approaches to evaluate and measure student competency, looking at some strategies for providing constructive feedback, and then we'll spend some time kind of logistically looking at our internship evaluation process at WVU and how that works. We have made some changes this year. So as I kind of lay the foundation for this, some context I think that's helpful. There's a number of parallel processes that are kind of at play with this evaluation. And so we want to just kind of frame it in this way. So the academic process, really, what field education is all about is helping students connect what they're learning in the classroom to practice in your settings and see how it is in real life. And so there's absolutely this kind of connection between theory and practice that is at play here. Then we have this client parallel. And so this is where, I try to say this to students a lot, and I think that you can help reinforce this, that the learning contract is not just kind of a document that needs to be done because we need it to be done. There's really a parallel between how we plan out work with our clients, and whether we do that in a micro way through treatment plans or more of kind of program goals. I think we can all acknowledge how important goal setting is as a skill for social workers. And that's really what learning contracts are, is a way to kind of lay the goals so that we know what we're going to evaluate and what we're going to accomplish. And so there's very much that parallel there between work we do with our clients. We also have this parallel with work as employees. And so as employees or as managers, we are often engaged in performance evaluations on one side of that or the other. This is quite similar to student evaluations, but I think that, acknowledging that there often is some anxiety around performance evaluations on either side of those. And, I noticed this too. I teach one of our courses on administration and leadership. And one of the things students often, comment on early on is one of the things that they imagine would be really hard about managing others is doing performance evaluations. So they're perceiving that anxiety on both sides of that. And I think this is also our opportunity to kind of model what this can look like. If we are giving feedback and kind of setting the stage well all the way along, then the performance evaluation doesn't need to be kind of a stressful, anxiety-inducing experience on either side of things. So this is our opportunity to kind of practice that. And then finally, we wanted to make this connection to termination. And this really comes down in that final evaluation. When we wrap things up with students, there's a lot of similarity to discharge planning. How do we kind of summarize what has been accomplished together and then kind of plan for next steps? And so we'll make some of these connections throughout the training today, but I think that helps kind of frame what it is that we're talking about. Turn over to Jamie.
So as Lindsay had said, there's this kind of academic parallel. So many of you don't see, the students do a reflection log for us every month, and we ask them in that to also tie theories to their placement as they're going through. So as we're tying this academic theory approach kind of for all of you to consider and think about what theories are at play as students are going through this process of an evaluation. So thinking in regards to, we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and thinking in regards to where are they at physiologically, are they safe, thinking about their social, their ego, and their self-actualization in this assessment process. Varun's theory kind of ties to how work effort leads to performance and reviews, right? So thinking in regards to really having a discussion to students about the effort that they put in, then also kind of leads to performance and looking at this. Then there have Adam's theory, looking at equity and justice, and really where we as employees or students in an environment are always looking for equity between themselves and other persons that they may be engaging with in that kind of peer setting. Really thinking in regards to Locke and Latham's goal setting, and looking in regards to, identifying a goal, setting that goal, and how do you meet and achieve that goal, and then how that goal is evaluated. Then going more into thinking in regards to the other perspectives that are there. DC talks about external elements that may be impacting a student's performance. So this is coming back to when we're doing kind of looking at that evaluation, but also through supervision is kind of this trauma approach and checking with students of what things outside may be impacting the work that they're doing, and always being aware of that. And then there's, thinking in regards to work design, where there's 5 important job characteristics: skills variety, task identity, task significance, feedback, and autonomy. So really, are we setting up goals for the students as we're going through that are of interest of them, that they have interest in learning about, that are aiding in value to their education, but how significant are them, right? We know that sometimes students do task in a placement setting that they may see as not really helping them in their education. So kind of finding that balance in regards to, giving them those equal opportunities. And then this idea of reinforcement, and really thinking in regards to, kind of going back to Skinner and thinking about, how do we reinforce students and give positive feedback? And as Lindsay had said, feedback should be continuous. So not just at this period of all of a sudden there's an evaluation. So reinforcing the student along the way during their whole placement process. And so kind of as we move from this academic part, then we kind of then shift over as to our second one, which was kind of the client parallel process. Lindsay, you're muted.
Okay, let's see. All right, so now coming back to this client side, so we start this with the learning contract, and while we're focusing a lot on the evaluation today, we couldn't start this training without talking about the learning contract, because that's really what is setting the stage for how the student will be evaluated. And so, again, we're all past this point in time. I know you're all current field instructors or site supervisors right now, and so students have either already finished this or they're just finalizing this. But as we think about the learning contract, this is really that document that's giving examples of how the students will allow you to assess their competency. And we really want to kind of emphasize that the evaluation is not asking you whether or not they completed the activity, but what level of competency did they demonstrate. And some of the changes that we've made to the evaluation this year are going to really kind of emphasize that shift on making sure that the questions you are asking, that you are answering, is really about that evaluation of competency, and taking the focus away from like whether or not did they do it. So as we look at the learning contract and what it's built on, we have these 9 core social work competencies. And again, just to kind of review, I'm not going to go through all the competencies, but I think it's important to know that these competencies are set by the CSWE, so our Council on Social Work Education. So these are the same at all social work programs across the U.S. that are accredited. We all have these same 9 core competencies, and this is really what our entire curriculum is founded on. So these are tied into our classroom and our field education work, and so in that kind of parallel to like a client treatment plan, these social work competencies play the role of kind of the broader goals. And these are the same on all students' learning contracts at any level. Then we get into the practice behaviors. And so this kind of takes us down to that parallel to the objective. So we've got the larger goal, and now we have this practice behavior objective. Each of our competencies will have between 2 and 4 practice behaviors. And these are behaviors that students will demonstrate that are going to help you assess their competency. And this is where really we're asking you to rate their competency on each of these practice behaviors, because that kind of maps up to the larger competency. Again, kind of worth knowing that the generalist students, so all of your BSW students or your first year MSW, so the ones that are doing either a 300 or a 400-hour internship at the generalist level, their practice behaviors are all the same, and they're all set by the CSWE. The specialized practice behaviors are set by schools. And so at WVU, our specialty area is around advanced integrative generalist practice. So we do set the practice behaviors for our generalist students. So if you have the generalist students doing the 600-hour internship, theirs are a little bit more specialized with that focus on kind of advanced integration But either way, these practice behaviors are going to be a little bit more specific so that they're mapping to the larger goals, but still broad enough that students are going to fit them to their specific placements. So to pull out an example here, this is from Competency 5, Engaging in Policy Practice. And we just pulled out as an example for us to kind of narrow down on this behavior B, apply critical thinking to analyze, formulate, and advocate for policies that advance human rights and social, racial, economic, and environmental justice. So again, still pretty broad language so that students at all different settings can fit this in. Then we get to the learning activities, and this is what the students are building into their learning contract. Everything else is kind of pre-filled for them. This is where they are going to make this learning contract specific to them. And so again, in this kind of client treatment plan parallel, this part is parallel to the intervention. So what is the student going to do with your support to meet each of these objectives? They're identifying 2 learning activities for each one of those practice behaviors. And these are the specific activities that they will do that's going to give you the opportunity to see them practice and demonstrate competence. And again, as we talk about our new form and where we've gone with this, and we're really trying to get the focus away from so much like using the learning contract as a checklist, but really looking at like, how did this activity allow them to demonstrate competence? We're still going to ask the students specifically to indicate their progress towards the learning activity. And so we'll look at that in more detail later, but we will ask the students to indicate, you know, did they do this activity? Did they do it partway? Did they maybe do something else that also demonstrated competence? Because what we're really asking you is to evaluate their competence based on what you saw through the activity on the learning contract or something similar. So again, as an example here, pulling from that same practice behavior around kind of critical thinking related to policy, we have pulled out, you know, a sample example where a student said, I will collaborate with my supervisor to make a potential policy recommendation that can be implemented at my agency. And so this is a specific thing that a student could do and you could look at and you'd be able to evaluate, you know, their critical thinking and what did they analyze and were they able to kind of pull some of these concepts related to, you know, social justice into that. So that's an example of something. And we wanted to share, we have, and you may know this isn't super new, but we have a sample document that's available. Jamie's putting that link in the chat now. It has sample activities tied to every competency that students are welcome to use. And this is a good tool. And we'll continue to update this. We updated this last year with some input from our field instructor training. And this is something that can just continue to be updated each year. So next we get to the verification. And so this is really kind of that measurable component of our objective, of our learning activity. And so we want to make sure that these things that the students say that they're going to do that are clear enough that you as a supervisor are going to have a way to see that they did it and you're going to be able to evaluate. And so we see that, you know, activities where students say like, I'm going to learn about, I'm going to read about, those aren't specific enough that you get to see the thought process. They might do it, but we need kind of an output past that so that you have the opportunity to kind of see what it is that they're learning and how they're thinking about it. This has always been one of the areas that our students struggled with. And so one of the changes we made this year for our BSW and generalist students, they this year had a drop-down menu. And I'll share some of those options. So they all had to put in their thing and then choose a method of verification. Our advanced students, we still expect them to be able to do that independently on their own with support, is to kind of make this learning activity measurable. So some examples of these verification methods, and these are the things that are in our drop-down menu. Commonly, it's discuss and supervision. Maybe they're reading an article and they're going to talk to you about it, or they're going to develop some sort of reflection document. As Jamie mentioned, our students do a reflection document for us each month. They don't go to you automatically, but if that's something that you want to look at with your student, you can talk about that. They are all writing reflection logs every month while they're in field. You might have them develop something useful, like not just a reflection document that somebody needs to read about, but maybe they can make a report or a fact sheet, or maybe they can develop a training for other staff. So they've learned about this, they've synthesized it, what can they do with it that is useful? Maybe they're attending an event, and then other, you know, they can come up with other things. This list is not exhaustive. So again, this is kind of that measurable and observable piece of what it is that they're doing. So now we like to talk about, you know, how do you have the opportunity to observe and evaluate your students? And I also want to recognize that this looks really different for all of us, depending on our setting and our supervision setup. You know, some of you may be outside supervisors and you're not with your student all the time. Maybe you're just meeting with them for the hour a week. So again, this looks different in different settings, but really giving thought to like, what are the things that you are going to be able to see your student doing, and how are you going to gather that information so that you're able to evaluate them? So direct observation is a great one if that works for you. And again, if you're an outside supervisor and you don't have that opportunity so much, maybe having conversations with some of the other professionals that they're working with, so you're able to kind of gather some of that feedback to give to them, that can be really helpful too. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but things that we sometimes are able to do with our students and give them feedback, you know, if we have the opportunity to co-facilitate. I have process recordings on here. This isn't something that we assign our students. Probably many of you did this when you were in school. I sure did. You are welcome to assign process recordings to your students if you find that a helpful way. That's something that, however you wanted that to look like, but that can be a space where if you don't get to do that direct observation, you could still kind of pick apart with the student, you know, what they did and how they felt about it and what kind of theories they were pulling into it. So that's something available. You can have them do case presentations to you or to other staff, having them create tools, having them self-report. So really a lot of ways, but you know, thinking creatively about what are the opportunities for you to observe their work and give them some feedback. And then kind of pulling that feedback in an ongoing way into your supervision so that it feels to the student like this assessment is happening on a continuous basis and not just when it's time to do the field assessment. So we know that strength-based feedback is generally appreciated with students. They want to know both what they're doing well and how they can improve. They know that they're there because they're practicing. And so sometimes I think we feel nervous to give that constructive feedback, but we certainly hear from students that they want that specific feedback. And so making sure that we have opportunities to do that. Having our feedback be planned, be continuous, happen in written and verbal ways. How can we build this into our regular practice? And there are opportunities to maybe pull into your regular supervision. Maybe you talk about one competency each week, or, you know, just thinking about some ways you can continue to use this and structure your regular supervision so that feedback is a part of it. Ideally, this is something that is reciprocal, you know, giving your students space to talk about what's going well for them. Are there opportunities that they want? Are there different, you know, are there styles that are working well for them? This growth mindset can be really helpful to consider, you know, here's where they are now, here's where we want to be. It can be helpful to talk to your students maybe about concepts that you struggled with early on, because that kind of normalizes this period of time. You know, some of the imposter syndrome can be a really good one to talk about. You know, how did you experience this and how can we normalize that and help them kind of continue on this trajectory? And then just kind of knowing that having some explicit conversations about assessment and feedback and how we do that, it builds trust and it also follows trauma-informed principles. And so just talking about the fact that we're evaluating, here's how we give feedback, how does your student like to receive feedback? And that again keeps that formal assessment from ever feeling like a surprise or being extra stressful. And so similarly, you know, what are some of these opportunities for ongoing feedback? If you have shared client interaction, you might have the opportunity to kind of process that afterwards. But again, different supervisory relationships and settings are different. You know, is there documentation you can review together? You can utilize our assessment form as a tool and kind of walk through that. You don't have to wait until it's time to do it. The student can open that up into Vera, and that can be something that you talk about as a regular part of your supervision. And this all really just allows us to model having some of these open and direct conversations related to goals and progress, so that just feels like a regular part of the experience. Jamie's going to start talking about some of our more specifics now.
Sorry, it wasn't letting me unmute. So as Lindsay had talked about it earlier, right? We have the academic parallel, then kind of the client parallel, which in the client parallel process is also this teaching of students to look at a goal and evaluate the goal. And how do you evaluate that and what does that mean? So we're kind of tying that end evaluation piece onto also moving into this kind of employment evaluation role and what that should look like for students. So with that in mind, we have changed our scoring rubric when you do the new assessments this year. to really reflect in what we're looking at, as we have said, like this whole idea of focusing on competencies, right? So moving from this 1 to 5 scale, with 1 being no competency, 2 minimal, 3 developing, which we tell all the students that really even at the end that this is maybe where they're at. Midterm, they might be between that 2 and 3 is where we're looking at, depending on what their field of practice has been before entering placement and kind of what their experience has been. And then emerging competency, and then really demonstrating competency. So really to be thoughtful, especially as you're at this midterm point, you know, I stress to the students when they will do their own competency rating, which we'll talk about, is to really be thoughtful and mindful of really where they are, but also for you as their field instructor, site supervisor, to also be mindful and to really use this as a point, which we'll talk about, to help them kind of get to that end goal accomplishment and kind of moving through that. So Lindsay, if you want to go ahead on to the next slide. So the other thing that we're really telling the students at this point of this midterm assessment is they all know the date at the beginning of the semester and they know when it's due, but that does not mean that they should be walking into anybody's office and being like, my plan is due and we have to get this done. This should really be a conversation that happens from the beginning of placement, be talking about placement. And if you're incorporating that feedback into all of your supervision, it should be guiding them through that midterm assessment. Again, thinking in regards to this is a format of both written and verbal feedback, there should not be any surprises. But as you're incorporating those things in, as Lindsay had really talked about, this idea of reciprocal conversation, right, is to also check in with the student at times of what is working at the placement for them and what is not working at the placement. It shouldn't just be an evaluation of the student, because we really should be working as is the agency also helping them to meet their competencies and giving them opportunities, because if not, then they're never going to meet those competencies levels. Also for the students, is I tell them that this midpoint assessment is really thinking about how do you get to that end goal again, right? And then connecting feedback to this professional role and in regards to this performance evaluation. So as we think about this, the next slide is going to kind of talk to us about in regards to that our assessments are a multi-step process, and it begins with the student. And we'll kind of walk through each of these phases because each phase is a little unique as they go through it, but the student is going to do a self-assessment. And then if the student has a site supervisor, the site supervisor is engaged in this process as much as they want to be, and as much feedback as they have to offer. The onus primarily of it refalls though on the field instructor, who is really going to be the one making the ultimate decision of that student's level of competency as a social worker, based on their expertise and knowledge of being a social worker and having that role of the field instructor. And then it will come to the faculty field liaison or the instructor of the class for review and determination on where that student is really falling in regards to their competency. So looking in regards to really where does the student self-assessment start? This looks very different if you've done a plan of ours in the past in regards to how the students are kind of rating themselves. So the students, as Lindsay had said, will have their practice behaviors and then their very specific task. So we are asking the students to first relay information to their site supervisors, field instructors, and to the faculty in regards to those very specific tasks. If they've not completed it, if they've partially completed it, if they fully have completed that activity, and then if not, because we know sometimes things change, if there's maybe been an alternative activity that has happened. So this is one of the big changes, because in the past we used to go back and redo the field learning plans, but now we're really having them include this in the assessment. And then based on what they kind of mark of that task that they're doing, we're asking them to provide a narrative explaining their progress in that goal and why they made that determination, but also then connecting it back to that competency. So if they're telling us, you know, that they, in regards to Lindsay's example, that they started the policy, it might be partially completed, but how does it relate back to that competency? What are they learning about policy? You know, maybe as that social justice piece, what they're learning, how are they meeting that? And providing you as a narrative for them to also demonstrate where their level of competency is coming in. So once the students kind of give it determination on just their practice goals, we are then also asking them to rate their belief and understanding of where they fall in on that same rating scale of their area of competency. And again, thinking in regards to at the midterm, we may have areas that are rated as 1 or 2. And as faculty, we're telling the students, that's fine. This is really for them just to make note that these are the areas in that second part of their field placement that they really need to start to focus on. Because we know in the first half of a semester, they're not going to probably work on all 9 competencies. It's a long term that they're doing this. So again, it's that point of planning forward to the next part of their placement and kind of walking through that. So they walk through that first part of what is their task, then their competency, and then they also give this area in regards to really what are their strengths or contributions and maybe areas of growth that they really want to achieve as they move forward. As the student does this part and kind of completes it, that as we talked about, there should have been a discussion early of who's really going to participate, what that looks like as far as timeframes. If it has been decided that the site supervisor is going to participate in this, that submission by the student will then carry that off to the next person, which might be the site supervisor, who we'll talk about here in a minute. But if not, it'll go to the field instructor. So if it's going on to the site supervisor, I'm going to go to the next slide, Lindsay. Oh, sorry, I had another slide in here. Before we jump over to that, the one thing is for the students, and we really reinforce this in class with them, that as this moves through the process, their deadline is their deadline. They have to follow it through the deadline date. They have to make sure that they've had a discussion with the site supervisor and field instructor, that you all have plenty of time in your calendar because you have a lot of things on your plate. And helping our students through this process is just one of those things. And it is their responsibility to make sure it gets to us on time, not yours as the site supervisor or field instructor, to make sure that we have it. And this is a professional competency of the students. So for the site supervisor, this is one of those areas I will say is a little bit weird. And as I did these this past semester, got some questions on. So it's really important to understand. For the midterm supervisor, you will see on the screen, there is only one area that is a supervisor. So if it is going to the site supervisor, they are going to rate where they believe the competency is. And as I have said to site supervisors, especially if you're a site supervisor that has an external field instructor, you may be seeing things that the student is doing that is really meeting competency that the field instructor might not be talking to them about. And so again, this is where the narrative part is really going to come into play. But the site supervisor has the ability to rate the level of competency for the student, with the big thing knowing, as I had said a few minutes ago, that the field instructor has kind of the onus of really giving that ultimate rating. So they can change this site supervisor. So a site supervisor may give you a 1 because they have not seen a student really talk about the competency, where in field supervision, they have talked about it a lot and it might jump up to a 3 or a 4. So that is kind of the one thing that's a little bit weird for that site supervisor, is that the field instructor may change that. I am an external field instructor with a site supervisor. I've been that role in the past as well. And the one thing that I have found is very helpful is for me to work very closely with that site super at the time of evaluation, and for us almost to do it together to really then know what the ratings are and kind of come up on an agreement. It just has saved us time and has been more efficient. So that is the one piece of advice. If you are in that position with a site supervisor and a field instructor, it might be helpful to do that. So as the site super goes through, they're just going to provide that competency rating, and then there is a narrative part. So Lindsay, go ahead on to the next slide. And again, it is this area in regards to narrative. And again, this narrative is conveying to the student why you gave that rating, but also to the field instructor, who is going to be the next person, of why you gave that rating. And then again, just like the student, there is this section at the end. You want to go to the next slide, Lindsay? They again gives the strengths, areas of weaknesses for the student. The site supervisor will then carry that. Once they hit submission, it will automatically go to the field instructor, who is the next slide. And again, kind of the same thing, you're just rating the competency of the student. The big thing for the field instructor at this point is that you may already have a rating in there from a site supervisor that you could agree with or you can change. You will then, as the next slide shows, also have a narrative section, which you are going to kind of relay again to the student in regards to why you provided the rating that you did and give very specific examples for this. And then the last part is, again, that kind of strengths and weaknesses that we're looking at for the student. Once it is completed by the field instructor, it is then submitted to the faculty field liaison for final review and assessment. So we, as the instructors or the faculty field liaisons, are reading through all of these, and we're looking in regards to all of the information that is provided by those ratings, but also those narratives. And then we have this year also changed for the midterm assessments that the students need to have a overall rating of their 9 competencies to a 2.5 or higher. So we're doing a back-end calculation to see where students are. Now with that, students aren't necessarily failing field if they're below that level, but this is really for us to have a conversation kind of from the instructional side of what is maybe not going well in placement or where are the gaps or reinforcing competencies for students to really help them understand what that looks like. The other thing that is kind of as it goes through this process that I tell all of my students and to all of you as site supervisors and field instructors, that even though we get this document and review it, we really hope that you are, again, bringing this back to the student and really walking through this with the student. And, you know, after it's completed, maybe your next your next supervision with the student is, hey, let's talk about this midterm assessment. Let's see, you know, maybe you gave yourself a 3, but I gave you a 2. And why are there those differences? Or, hey, on this one, we are both saying you're at a 5. Do we need to work on this anymore? Or what is the priority going forward to kind of move you? To really use this as a template in regards to helping the student through their process of field.
The final evaluation, it follows the exact same process as the midterm assessment. So we don't need to talk about that in that capacity, but really just kind of that conversation. So as the internship is ending, you know, this is towards the end. I like to emphasize this doesn't need to be the last thing that your student does. It's great to finish this up in the last couple of weeks, but it can be just kind of part of wrapping up. There also should be a time to sit down and discuss the evaluation. And kind of coming back to those parallels, we see this as similar to the termination and discharge planning process. So this is a great time to kind of wrap up, you know, on a positive. Where did the growth happen this year? You know, what did the student take away? But also, where are they going now? What do their future goals look like? How might they stay in touch with you professionally? You know, are you somebody that they could use as a reference in the future? You know, what kind of relationship might they continue to have with you and your agency, and really just kind of setting them up to go on their professional career with that kind of wrap up conversation, much like a discharge planning. And then that reciprocal part is really great too. This is a good opportunity to kind of get their impression of the internship. Are there things that you might do a little bit differently, you know, maybe in onboarding an intern in the future? Are there any things that they think would have been helpful, or things that they did that might kind of bring about some change or streamlining of the internship program in general? So having that conversation is a great kind of ending thing. But again, it doesn't need to happen on the very last day. We are also kind of pushing students to make sure this gets done. This is really important.
Yeah, and before you go forward, Lindsay, one of the things too, because I know some of you on this call have students who are in employment-based placements. This is also really, I tell the students that even though you're in employment-based, there is still this piece of termination, right? Because you are terminating being a student learner in your work environment and now moving back to just an employee. And even as I have some of my students in my generalist placement, we were just talking about this week in our synchronous session. is as a student, they have taken on new activities and responsibilities, some which they love and want to try to incorporate into their work. So that discussion needs to happen. And others, they're like, I am done taking on extra work, right? And I just want to go back for the next 6 months between my placements and be an employee. And really talking to them about how do you do that in this termination process, right? So for those of you who are field instructors and site supervisors who have students who are employees, that there is still a termination process for them because they are terminating as a student employee and now just going back to an employee. And we're really encouraging them on our end to think about that. So we hope that you kind of incorporating that in this process as well.